I'm not going to be talking about your denial or their denial, but our denial, the ways in which collectively we find it hard to grasp and respond adequately to climate change. So in our work, we recognize that the traumatized person can't tell a clear story. Parts are blocked out, and others intrude in an out-of-control way. So the individual is fully in the relentless grip of being affected, but those effects are hard to understand and process. There's growing evidence that some environmental activists, people very well informed about climate change and its consequences, sometimes describe symptoms which, if they were more serious, we would associate with PTSD, intrusion, nightmares, and preoccupation. A colleague of mine, who was a senior journalist with the BBC and is now a psychotherapist, Mark Brain, spelt with a Y, adapted the impact of event scale to look at feelings about climate change. And I've used this in discussion meetings with psychotherapists as a starter to conversations about the emotional impact of climate change. And not uncommonly, individuals identify intrusion. I think about climate change when I don't mean to. Pictures of climate change pop into my mind. I've been having waves of strong feeling about it. Or they identify avoidance. I've been actively trying not to think about it. I have a lot of feelings about it, but I haven't been dealing with them. I feel as if climate change isn't happening or is unreal. And some hyperarousal. When I think about it, I feel irritable or angry, jumpy, and have problems sleeping. And Helen Berry's work that we've just heard her describe briefly clearly demonstrates the link between climate change and mental health. For many years, part of my work was as an expert witness in Children Act proceedings. Assessing parents, the courts wanted to know what's wrong. Why can't this parent care for their children? What can be done to help? Can they change? And of course, the parents had often been in conditions where emotions and behavior had not been contained. They needed, as adults, to recover the capacity to think and process when this vital personal and interpersonal skill had not been fostered, modeled, or even permitted. And in making the assessment, one of the theoretical concepts I drew on was of narrative competence. And this concept derives from extensive attachment theory research, which has shown that the nature of someone's attachment style can be inferred not only from the content of what is told, but from the style of describing their history. And Mary Main describes how when adults talk about their emotional lives and their important relationships in growing up, what determined their current emotional security, and therefore their potential to provide secure parenting, was less to do with what happened in their childhoods, but much more on whether they had an internally coherent and consistent narrative. The capacity to reflect on the past meaningfully is one good prognostic sign as to whether the parent could think about the child, care for them, and this then might become useful evidence for the court to think about whether rehabilitation might be possible. What wasn't helpful was a dismissive avoidance style, dismissive of emotions, the child's and their own, dismissive of the concerns of others, and any attempt to make meaning. Or conversely, an enmeshed, preoccupied or disordered narrative where I was left unclear what was being described or when, and a difficulty in using attempts to help with any reflection. So where my thinking is going, that for me, the question is, can we as individuals and collectively develop a coherent account of our own blindness, including our blindness about climate change? The story is a complex one for each of us, involving not just the psychological, but the economic, the ethical, and the broadest sense, spiritual. It's a tall order. Can we include in that account an understanding of the personal and societal pressures that have been on us, that have made us unable to think and feel and act, and how we have lived in ways that aren't consistent with love for the future of our children and our children's children, if you like, the children of the world. A related story that I think we're all implicated in is that of consumerism, the narrative that goes, I can't manage without stuff, we can have it when we want it and as much as we want and not think of the consequences. So we can think we want a book and order it online. It's so instant. We can even order our wonderful ecologically sound books online at the press of a button. The UNICEF report a few years ago on the welfare of UK children was damning of the way goods are substituted for time and love, with no return in the way of happiness. And Clive Hamilton's book, Requiem for a Species, notes that even if in this generation we can curb our consumerism, the market has planted a poison pill deep within affluent society. A generation of children consciously moulded into hyper-consumers. In 1983, US companies spent $100 million annually advertising to children, and by the end of the boom, they were spending more than £17 billion a year. And a British study found that 1 in 4 children, their first recognisable word is a brand name. So I think the story of how we've got to here and how we move on has to include reflections on the challenges we face in a cultural transformation in the direction of ecologically sustainable living and, as we are considering today, ecologically sustainable work. As my work with parents shows, we can't do this on our own. The ability to tell the story is relational and constructed in conversation. Psychotherapist Rosemary Randall has developed a methodology called Carbon Conversations. This was driven by her appreciation of the vital part that psychology can play in bringing about social change. And carbon conversation groups offer a supported group experience that helps people halve their personal carbon footprint. They deal with difficulties of change by connecting to values, emotions, and identity. And the method was selected by The Guardian as one of the 20 most promising solutions to climate change. There are now community and workplace versions, and it has found a place in Scottish Government. I'm trying not to use a car so much at the moment, so I haven't owned one for 15 months, and I rent one when I need. It's actually very easy for me to do this. I won't tell you how many miles I've driven in the past. I live in a town where it's very easy to get to the shops walking or by bike. There's a very good public transport system. That isn't difficult. My most difficult character-building moment is in the winter months when it's pouring with rain and I come out of the consulting room to go to a yoga class 1 mile away, and I wish I had my car. And that's how wedded we are to the convenience of our lifestyle. And of course, I just give myself a little talk. Come on, Judith, just get the right clothes. It isn't the wrong weather. But it's interesting for me. Just what happens when we make that step and then we notice how we're so easily drawn back. And so constructing this narrative of our ignoring of climate change, our ignoring of what needs to be done, is work in progress. But what if we can't do this? And here I think the different psychological modalities can all contribute to understandings. And I go along with what Simon said. We're not here trying to define an entity which is called climate change denial. This is not a pathology. It's a very complicated understanding. So ideas from depth psychotherapy show us the familiar ways in which we defend ourselves about what is unbearable, the defences we work with every day in our shared attempts to help people change, and that we encounter within ourselves when we're looking to change. It's not happening. Look at the wet summer. It's someone else's fault, not mine. Look at all those new Chinese power stations. Well, actually, they're burning power to make the stuff that we buy. But it's someone else's responsibility, not mine. The government should do something. What's the point? We're screwed. We're toast. The whole thing's gone too far. It's not safe to think about climate change. What will I feel? Can I bear the grief, the guilt? I'll lose my identity if I think about climate change. I love my lifestyle, my cars. I won't even be the same person. It won't benefit me to think about climate change. I'll have to give up so much. I'll lose my business. What about my holidays? My parents in India, my kids in Australia? What about economic growth? Sally Weintraub, who's a psychoanalyst, differentiates between negation and disavowal. Denial as negation occurs when we're still in some relationship to what is denied, a death or another loss, where denial is part of the process that can, with support, be travelled. She says, negation denies, but it does not much distort the shape of what is denied. So we're shocked when we hear someone has died. We say, it can't be true, but that doesn't last long, though it can recur when we see the person in the street or accidentally lay a place for them at the table. Disavowal, on the other hand, is more pathological. It's a more fixed state where lies and distortions occur. And she says it happens when reality is too obvious to be simply denied by negation, where there's anxiety that the damage is already too great to repair, and where it's felt not enough support and help is there to bear the anxiety and suffering that the knowledge of reality brings. So in a bereavement situation, we might refuse to go to the funeral because they haven't died. I recommend to you George Marshall's newly published book, Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. It's available in Kindle at the moment. It's been published in the States first, and it'll come out in the UK this month. So I'm going to draw on some more psychological strands. Looking at the neurobiology of threat, climate change does not fit our basic threat responding capacities. At our most basic, we best respond to risks that are immediate, certain, visible, happening to us or those near us, caused by somebody else, and with obvious solutions. Climate change is, or so we tell ourselves, distant, disputed, invisible, happening, if at all, to people a long way off. It's caused by us all and has complex implications and solutions. We can also think about how we respond to risk, and generally, we're much better at responding to those certain risks, but also we find it very hard to accept short-term costs and sacrifices to mitigate against higher and uncertain costs perceived as far in the future. And of course, this also affects governments, so that governments are massively poor at putting resources that are really needed, despite Lord Stern's recommendations. And so we're not really helped when they behave just like us. We've got this wonderful target of reduction of 80%, but actually the funds haven't been put in place to achieve that. Cognitive psychologists tell us that once we have a view, we cherry-pick the evidence that confirms our position and modify new information to fit this. And so the cold weather in the United States last year was used by the deniers as evidence that they were right all along. They filtered out the evidence that actually Scandinavia was very warm. So we filter experience through our preconceived ideas, and we also make up our minds on what's available now. As I've said, changing our minds on the certainty of climate change with the weather. And you all know about Boris Johnson seeing an icicle on the traffic lights on his cycle ride to work and suggesting perhaps the skeptics are right after all. I hope somebody went to see him. There are also very important interpersonal, social, and political factors that need to be understood, because the way that we talk about climate change becomes affected with social meaning. I often talk about climate change to colleagues who are interested in social justice, emphasizing the social justice aspects of climate change. And of course, some of those were raised by Helen Berry. It's the poorest and the most disadvantaged who suffer the most. If we look at an event like Hurricane Katrina, which arguably may have been made worse by climate change, but even if it wasn't, we see there what happens, who suffered the most, the people who couldn't get away, who were black and poor. And they were all told by their president to get into cars and drive away, and they didn't have them. We're also very influenced by our peers and our need for social conformity, and this affects whether we act. So it may be that the so-called bystander effect takes place as we look to see what are others saying or doing or not. The facts about climate change are also trumped by emotionally laden stories that speak to our core values. And in particular, we can be drawn to storylines of good and evil. And actually the kind of stories that are told by both campaigners and denialists, if you take out exactly what they're saying about climate change, they're very, very similar. So for the deniers, the activists are the wicked ones who want to take over controlling the world. And the world needs saving by the stringent beliefs of the denialists to expose their false motivation. They're only doing this to get money for research, etc. Whereas, of course, I would say it, the good guys are trying to expose the vast financial resources poured into the denialism movement. And here I am distinguishing between what is called denialism, which is the massive amount of money poured into different think tanks. And I think that's a rather different issue than the ordinary kind of denial that affects us all. We're also very influenced by who talks to us about climate change. So if we don't trust tree-hugging woolly environmentalists and they talk about climate change in their terms, we may not trust them because we've decided they're not to be trusted anyway. And there's some interesting research about the messenger and the message that George Marshall quotes, that in one particular area of the States, they discovered that 65% of people believed there should be stronger gun control. So you'd think they would vote for somebody in favour of gun control. The problem is 85% of them don't think someone who promotes gun control can be trusted. So that's very interesting. There's something very important about the messenger. We're very influenced by the role of the media, suggesting, as with vaccination, that the facts are equally contested. And scientists care to be very precise in the language of risk, can be interpreted as uncertainty compared to the strident authoritarian tones of a denial lobbyist. And we then use uncertainty and as an excuse for inaction. I've said I don't think leadership helps us where governments don't seem to be really taking climate change seriously. I do think that broadly the medical profession in coming out about climate change is doing something that's very important for wider society. And there are other organisations too. I had in the Post yesterday a letter from the National Trust, and I discovered actually 6% of the population of this country belong to the National Trust. So there would have been 3 or 4 million people had this drop. And on one side of the envelope it says, the storms have passed, but the cost to the coast is stacking up. And then on the back it says, there's more trouble brewing. And inside there's a very clear linking of the weather with climate change. I've even been using in my own locality some of the information from ASDA. I try not to go to supermarkets personally, but ASDA has actually got hold of the fact that something like 90% of their food supplies are going to be affected by climate change. So they've got some very, very interesting material. And I think it's very important when ideas about food security affected by climate change are normalised. This is not some extreme fringe people talking. It's very mainstream. So our capacity to recover from denial depends on negotiating these difficult areas. There's no value, of course, in staying stuck with self-recrimination, but our capacity to think flexibly in this complex area depends on being able to negotiate the kind of areas that I've been talking about. I'd like to suggest in ending that we really need greater materialism. You'll think this sounds odd, but I think we need a more considered materialism, a different kind of materialism in the sense of valuing, honouring and respecting what sustains us, an embodied mattering of ourselves and the ecosystems we depend on. And I think that that's one part of sustainability. I also think that in the same way that we often, where appropriate, recommend mindfulness practices to service users, we could do much worse than adopting a mindful approach to the kind of feelings and inactions and actions that we find ourselves drawn to in relation to climate change. Thank you.